human rights. A concept so fundamental, so intrinsically tied to our very existence, that it seems almost absurd to question its validity. We are told that every human being, by virtue of their birth, is endowed with certain inalienable rights. Rights that transcend borders, cultures and ideologies. Rights that should guarantee a life of dignity, freedom and security for all. But what becomes of promises made in the aftermath of tragedy? Do they hold their weight as years turn into decades, or do they fade into empty rhetoric, convenient platitudes trotted out for political gain? Look around the world today and you will witness a stark disconnect between the lofty ideals of human rights and the lived experiences of countless individuals. From the refugee fleeing persecution, only to be met with closed borders and indifference, to the political prisoner languishing in a cell for daring to speak truth to power, the gap between rhetoric and reality yawns wide. How can we reconcile the principles of equality and justice with the systemic discrimination, the entrenched power structures that continue to marginalize and oppress entire populations? This is the uncomfortable truth we must confront. Human rights are often used selectively, a weaponized tool in the arsenal of international relations, a means to exert pressure, to demonize adversaries, to justify intervention, all while masking self-interest beneath a veneer of moral righteousness. The inconvenient truth is this: the pursuit of power, the relentless hunger for resources and dominance, often trumps any genuine commitment to human rights. The very notion of a universal moral code is challenged when powerful nations, driven by their own strategic interests, are allowed to operate with impunity. This is not to say that human rights are meaningless, that the fight for dignity and justice is futile, but it is a call to move beyond the simplistic narratives, the comfortable illusions, and to confront the uncomfortable realities of the world we live in. To acknowledge that the fight for human rights is not a linear progression towards some utopian ideal, but a constant struggle against the forces of oppression, greed and apathy. And the year is 1948. The world is still picking up the pieces of a devastating war, the horrors of the Holocaust still fresh in the collective memory. It is against this backdrop of unimaginable suffering that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is born, a bold, even audacious attempt to rewrite the rules of engagement on the world stage. The promise is simple, yet profound. Never again would humanity stand by and allow such atrocities to occur. Never again would individuals be stripped of their inherent dignity, their fundamental rights trampled upon by the powerful. The UDHR, with its eloquent articulation of rights to life, liberty and security, represented a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring belief in the inherent worth of every human being. But even as the ink dried on the document, questions lingered. Could this document, forged in the crucible of war, truly deliver on its lofty promises? The decades following the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights witnessed a world grappling with the complexities of its implementation. The Cold War cast a long shadow, dividing the globe into ideological camps, each wielding the language of human rights as a weapon in their struggle for supremacy. The promise of universality collided with the realities of a world still riven by power imbalances, where the pursuit of national interest often took precedence over the protection of human dignity. The newly independent nations of the developing world, many emerging from the shackles of colonialism, found themselves caught in the crosshairs of this ideological battleground. Even as some progress was made in codifying and promoting human rights, the gap between rhetoric and reality persisted. The hypocrisy was stark, eroding the moral authority of those who claimed to be the guardians of human dignity. To understand the challenges facing human rights today, we must acknowledge the long shadow cast by history. The colonial enterprise, with its brutal legacy of exploitation, racism and cultural annihilation, continues to shape the global landscape, perpetuating inequalities and fueling resentment. The arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers, often dividing communities and igniting ethnic tensions, continue to be a source of conflict and instability. The developing world, burdened by debt, poverty and the devastating impacts of climate change, often finds itself at the mercy of international institutions dominated by the very same powers that once colonized them. The pursuit of profit, the insatiable hunger for resources, continues to drive policies that prioritize the interests of the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. This is the uncomfortable truth that we must confront. The legacy of colonialism continues to cast a long shadow over the human rights landscape. Human rights, we are told, are universal. They apply to everyone, everywhere, regardless of nationality, religion, or political affiliation. But look closer and a different picture emerges, a two-tiered system where some are more equal than others. The very nations that hold themselves up as champions of human rights often operate with a blatant disregard for the principles they claim to uphold. Their foreign policies are driven not by a genuine commitment to human dignity, but by strategic interests, by the relentless pursuit of power and profit. Intervention or invasion, the blurred lines of morality. Military interventions, often launched under the banner of human rights, have a devastating track record. Regime change, sold as a path to freedom and democracy, often leaves behind chaos and instability, creating power vacuums that are quickly filled by new forms of tyranny. The unintended consequences, the civilian casualties, the long-term destabilization, are rarely given the same weight as the initial justifications. The language of human rights, so easily co-opted, becomes a smokescreen, a way to mask the true motives driving these interventions, securing resources, projecting power, eliminating rivals. Sanctions, a silent weapon. And then there are sanctions. The economic weapons deployed to punish and isolate regimes deemed to be in violation of international norms. But who truly bears the brunt of these sanctions? More often than not, it is the most vulnerable. The poor, the sick, the elderly, who suffer the most. Sanctions, while intended to target the ruling elite, often cripple entire economies, leading to widespread shortages of food, medicine and essential goods. The humanitarian cost, the human suffering inflicted, is rarely given adequate consideration. They can entrench corrupt regimes, fueling resentment and undermining any hope of peaceful change. The United Nations, the International Criminal Court. These institutions, born out of the ashes of global conflict, were entrusted with the solemn duty of upholding human rights, of ensuring that the atrocities of the past would never be repeated. But have they lived up to these lofty ideals, or have they become entangled in the very power dynamics they were meant to transcend? The UN Security Council, tasked with maintaining international peace and security, is often paralyzed by the veto power wielded by its permanent members. The very body entrusted with preventing conflict can become a stage for geopolitical point scoring, its pronouncements ringing hollow in the ears of those who look to it for protection. The International Criminal Court, established to prosecute individuals accused of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, was hailed as a landmark achievement in the pursuit of international justice. Yet the ICC's track record has been marred by accusations of selective enforcement and political bias. The vast majority of its investigations and prosecutions have focused on Africa, leading to accusations of neocolonialism and double standards. Powerful nations, particularly those that have not ratified the Rome Statute, have often escaped scrutiny, their own human rights records conveniently overlooked. The pursuit of justice, it seems, is often subject to the whims of political expediency, the noble ideals of accountability and impartiality, sacrificed on the altar of realpolitik. NGOs fill the void left by institutional failings, advocating for forgotten victims of human rights abuses. Armed with convictions and a shoestring budget, they tirelessly document abuses, provide aid, and pressure governments. They face immense challenges operating in hostile environments, facing censorship, intimidation, and violence. Despite obstacles, NGOs hold the line against human rights abuses. Their work is essential and often thankless. The fight for human rights is won in the trenches. The Middle East, a region steeped in history and the echoes of ancient civilizations in the birthplace of major religions. Yet it stands today as a tragic testament to the failings of the international system, a stark reminder of the human cost when power trumps principle. From the intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict to the horrors unfolding in Yemen and Syria, the Middle East has become a crucible of broken promises. The international community, paralyzed by its own divisions and beholden to powerful interests, appears either unwilling or unable to break the cycle of violence and impunity that has plagued the region for decades. The stories that emerge from this region, stories of displacement, of dispossession, of lives shattered by bombs and bullets, are a searing indictment of the world's collective failure to uphold the most basic tenets of human dignity. Gaza, a narrow strip of land densely populated bordering the Mediterranean Sea. Instead, it has become a symbol of human suffering, a stark example of the devastating consequences of a conflict with no end in sight. For over a decade, Gaza has been subjected to a crippling blockade, its borders tightly controlled, its economy strangled. The humanitarian situation is dire. Basic necessities like clean water, electricity, and medical supplies are in chronic short supply. The infrastructure, battered by repeated military operations, lies in ruins. Children born into this open-air prison grow up with the constant threat of violence, their futures uncertain. Yemen, often referred to as the Forgotten War, a conflict that has largely escaped the scrutiny of the international media. A country on the brink of famine, its infrastructure decimated, its people caught in the crossfire. The statistics are staggering, almost too horrific to comprehend. Millions on the verge of starvation, countless children dying from preventable diseases, schools, hospitals, markets, all have become targets, bombed with impunity. The conflict in Yemen is a stark reminder of the cynical calculus of power politics. The international community has turned a blind eye to the atrocities unfolding in Yemen. Syria, a nation once full of promise, now shattered by a decade of brutal civil war. A conflict that began with peaceful protests, met with brutal repression, spiraled into violence. The images from Syria have seared into our collective conscience. The siege of Aleppo, the chemical weapons attack on Ghouta, the endless stream of refugees fleeing for their lives. The conflict in Syria is a case study in the dangers of unchecked power. The use of chemical weapons was met with half-hearted condemnations. The veto power has shielded the Syrian regime from meaningful consequences. The world has watched as Syria has been torn apart, becoming complicit in their suffering. The stark reality we must confront is this: the very notion of universal human rights is built on a foundation of hypocrisy. We, in the privileged West, enjoy our freedoms, often oblivious to the suffering of those in the shadows of our prosperity. We preach human rights, yet turn a blind eye to systems of exploitation and power imbalances. We tell ourselves that the horrors in distant lands are not our problem. We build walls to keep uncomfortable truths at bay. Our indifference, our silence, speaks volumes. We become part of the problem. Yet, even amidst the darkness, there is hope. A new generation is rising, less willing to accept the status quo. Across the globe, young people are taking to the streets, demanding a better world. They are harnessing the power of technology, using social media to mobilize support. They are building bridges across borders, forming a global movement for change.